Welcome to SCI-Arc. I'm Hernan Diaz Alonso. I'm the director of the school. My remarks are going to be as brief as I can make it, since you guys are here on a Friday night to watch movies, which is what we always done since we were kids. I just want to point out a couple of things. One, that this is the first year of this format. That David Rue, our Edge chair, the postgrad programs here at SCI-Arc, orchestrated this year with 4 days of symposiums. This has been incredibly intense and fascinating, and a different form of to evaluate the work of the students over the whole year. The postgrad have 4 different tracks. Tonight is the last program. It's Architecture, Entertainment, and Fiction, which Liam Young is the head professor of it. And they're doing a phenomenal job. This is the first full year of the program, and already we are super excited about what the work that in a territory in which architecture keeps expanding and it's not so clear anymore where architecture ends or starts. Architecture is not longer only about building, it's a way to understand culture. Probably always has been, but more than ever right now, those intersections are becoming more and more blurred, which for us is exciting and fascinating, since it has been a long, long tradition of the school in kind of an informal way. And I think through this program, we try to channel that energy and those way of thinking, which, of course, being in Los Angeles and all that, make it like a natural place. But also it's important that Liam and all the different guests and professors he have along the year is introducing a whole different angle about this. It's not really about one single issue. There are multiples on the table, and I think this is a fascinating territory in which we think that a big part of the game will be played in the next years to come for a school of architecture like ours and others. So I'm going to let David Rue, the chair of the program, to go more into the conversation about the format of what has been this week. And then I'll let Liam to introduce the incredibly amazing group of distinguished guests that we have for tonight. So once again, I want to thank everybody for being here, and I'll let you in the fantastic hands and brain of David Rue.
It's really nice to see everybody here on a Friday evening in the summer. Nothing like a film festival on a summer night. So we got 4 programs in SCI-Arc Edge, and this is the first annual SCI-Arc Symposium, and it's nice to see we're going to go out with a bang here. So just once again, I've said this a couple of times already during this week of panel discussions. We have 4 programs. We have Architectural Technologies, Design of Cities, a Theory and Pedagogy program for training future teachers. And these 3, I think, to some degree, are obvious programs within the architectural discipline. And these are kind of known fields, whereas fiction and entertainment might not immediately register as something that comes from the architectural discipline. But Liam and I and Hernan, we discussed these 2 words, fiction and entertainment, very carefully in planning this program and the lead up to it. These are 2 very loaded words, and I think the significance of fiction and entertainment in contemporary life is not to be underestimated. So I think the work that the students have produced throughout the year, I think, will begin to develop what I hope is an entirely new discourse within architecture, as well as interfacing with other affiliated fields that I think we've always been next to throughout the 20th century. So I'm going to really leave it at there and let Liam really just maybe discuss and unroll the topics behind the work in the panel discussion. So the films will be played continuously. It will be under 1 hour of just playing the movies and seeing the work. And please stick around for then the panel discussion that will come after the movies. We're going to set up tables here. And Liam has invited a number of very interesting, provocative guests, and he'll introduce them later. But I think you'll want to see what the conversation will be by these people that we've invited. So with that, Liam, would you like to say anything to introduce? Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for all of you to join us tonight. The booze and sushi will go on for a little while yet, if you get bored or peckish. But please do find your way back in. And the format for the evening, as David suggested, we're going to screen the films. I'm going to play the role of MC, really, and introduce the films, each film a little bit before we play it, and just to introduce the maker of the film as well. And then we're going to do a swift changeover, and as David suggested, we've got an amazing group of guests somewhere embedded, infiltrated in the room, that hopefully we'll find them again and they'll come up and sit up front and not just discuss the work, but really we wanted to invite a group of people that would be able to put the work in some kind of context, both an industry context, but also to talk a bit about what it means to make this type of work, what it means for people in a place like this to tell a story or to make a film. And we're going to introduce that and unpack that a little bit before we kick off, just with an intro film, if we can start to cue that up. If you don't know me, my name's Liam Young. I'm the coordinator of the Fiction Entertainment Program. Beside me is Alexi Marfin, architect and filmmaker, who teaches on the program as well. And also in the room, in the darkness, is a group of students who we've spent a year with constructing and crafting these projects. Should we get going? Okay. And our glamorous assistant, in charge of the swiping on the Macintosh. Can we have the sound? No. We're going to start with the first one. Yeah. Gotta stop So in the studio, we're interested in this idea that the way we perceive culture and the spaces around us is largely determined by the mediums of fiction and entertainment. And these extraordinary shared languages are the vehicles through which many of us exchange ideas and engage with our environment. And for us, it's impossible to underestimate the importance of media in the production of culture. So in film, video games, and literature, we've always imagined alternative worlds as a means to understand our own world in new ways. So in the studio, we use storytelling as a powerful medium through which we can prototype our most wondrous hopes or our darkest fears of the future. So in fiction and entertainment, we deploy techniques from film, fiction, gaming, VR, and so forth to visualize new worlds in which to prototype the architectural and emerging implications of new technologies. And we travel out on location shoots to document existing phenomena, to exaggerate present trends, and to project possible alternatives. And this year we traveled to the emerging superpower of India, and in the same way perhaps that Blade Runner of 1982 collaged Japan with LA, a country then seen as the next global superpower at the height of the personal electronics bloom, where we all walked silently dancing to the beats of a Sony Walkman or watching pirated films on a home video cassette recorder. The studio asks, just as Hollywood machines prepare for the next installment, what might the imaginary worlds of film and fiction have to say about us now? If we were to remake this project, then what trends would we exaggerate? What problems would we solve or accelerate? If we were future archaeologists, then what could the imaginary worlds of fiction and entertainment tell us about the contemporary city? So in this way, the work slips between the real and the imagined, where speculative fictions become a way of exploring a world where everyday stories struggle to grasp. So all the work you'll see here is developed entirely by the students themselves, where they conceptualize, write, direct, shoot, and post-produce all of their projects in the space of 1 year. And a lot of them come into this project with no training in the field, but in many ways they're all here to take advantage of a truly intriguing moment in entertainment, where the tools of the industry have been democratized and made accessible. And in this way, we're trying to develop a body of work that's based around indie-style narratives, but with larger budgets and visual effects. So we're not trying to be a film school here, but we're interested in what happens when designers, architects, and world builders make film, parasitically occupying the entertainment industry like Trojan horses, seeding popular media with critical ideas about space, city, and technology. And across the next hour, we're going to see 6 short films developed by the student group. And as I said, I'll introduce each one as we kick off, just to give you a sense of who it is behind the scenes making all of this. So this is our first film, which is made by Piers Myers. Piers is a designer and filmmaker with a background in anthropology. And he's interested in our cultural relationship to data and technology, where we use words like cloud to disguise an immensely physical infrastructure that spans the globe. So in this project, Piers has imagined a post-human city of data center towers, an Indian special economic zone not built for us, but rather for the digital needs and wants of a city far, far away. So in this context, we're just an afterthought. People are just a parasitic community living off the resources of internet infrastructure. We're slum dwellers, pirating energy, information, and cooled air from the data tower. And where a group of kids make use of a different resource, the heat, to use their updraft to fly their kites. So the film follows a battle between 2 kids who use the wind from the data centers to kite fight and to own the skies on their favorite day of the year, when the world goes online, clicks check out, and buys. The film's called Cyber Monday.
Dadkuna kala maansana, dadku वेदांत पीछे आ चल जल्दी आना ऐसे फिक्स करते हैं काइट को जगह में जा रहा हूँ
So our next film is from landscape architect Tim Wee from Brazil. And Tim has always been interested in our relationship to nature. So in Electro Botanica, Tim has developed a set of short vignettes or episodes taken from a world where nature is technology. So on the eve of ubiquitous GM, engineered climates, and the radical Anthropocene, Tim asks how we might recalibrate our relationship to this moving target we've constructed as nature. So the film follows the launch of Samsung Botanica's newest cellular device, the ESP3, the first smartphone to be sold as a seed and nurtured by customers to functional maturity. It's a device that creates smell emojis or smojis, a device of germination, pollination, and ejaculation, of spore MS, an absurd biotech world set in California, a world where cell towers are deciduous, pollen allergies are dysfunctional, and Adderall fruit tastes like strawberries.
Você viu só que amor, nunca vi coisa assim. E passou, nem parou, mas olhou só pra mim. Se voltar, vou atrás, vou pedir, vou falar. Vou dizer que o amor foi feitinho pra dar. Olha, é como o verão, quente o coração. Salta de repente para ver a menina que vem.
Ele vem, sempre tem em cima no olhar. Vai ver.
Thank it if you're small. I don't need you. I don't have to plead you. You know my name. Will I feel the same? I am so groovy now. And I don't care. You know the rules. I'm not a fool. If you think I am, will I feel the same? I am so groovy now, and I don't care.
What? When?
Tuesday.
Oh my god, I can't believe you finally asked him out. What did he say?
That was it. He just sent me this emoji, nothing else.
Eu trago bananas pra vender. Bananas de todas qualidades, quem vai querer? Olha a banana.
A smoji without a taste text? Who does that?
I know, right?
No, like seriously, who does that? It's really annoying.
Well, like, what do you think it means?
I don't know, because it starts off sweet, but then it gets funky.
Vai trabalhar, vagabundo. Olha a banana.
Well, maybe he's just being polite. Like, oh, it was really great to meet you, but I'll pass.
Oh, like, you're so great, but I never want to see you again.
Mm-hmm, exactly. What? Yeah. We got along so well.
You know what? You're overthinking this. You guys have so much in common. Like, you're the only two people I know who grows their own asparagus.
You're the best. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Thank you.
I'm sorry, ladies. I couldn't help but oversmell, and he's definitely not interested. That bad smell at the end, it's a dead giveaway.
Na na na, eu não.
Nem vem que não tem, nem vem de garfo que hoje é dia de sopa. Esquenta o ferro, passa minha roupa. Eu nesse embalo vou botar pra quebrar. Sacudim, sacudá, sacudingo.
Are you okay?
Oh, yeah. I'm absolutely fine. All good over here.
Tira o tamanho, tem sinteco no chão. Eu nesse embalo vou botar pra quebrar. Sacudim.
Good evening. Tonight we have 3 exclusive wines from the LA region. First we have a Koreatown Cabernet, earthy with a hint of almond. Then we have a Culver City Pinot Noir, and lastly...
You should have told me you had allergies.
I don't really like to talk about it much. We'll take a Skid Row Sauvignon.
Excellent choice.
Sacudim, sacudá, sacudingo, dingo, vem numa casa de caboclo. Já disseram.
How's your food?
It smells so good. I cannot wait to eat this.
Would the couple like one more bottle?
No.
Nem vem que não tem.
There's something magical about planting your most personal device, nurturing it, and experiencing the world with it by your side. As I speak, we are replacing hundreds of factories of old, obsolete phones. We are freeing up thousands of acres of prime land to be replanted with an entirely new line of Sambo products.
I didn't forget it on purpose.
It's a sit-in. It's like all you have to bring.
You brought Adderall fruit.
Why do I even invite you to these things? It's time.
This is not only our best smart plant yet, but a huge step towards a world of endless possibilities. Again?
You have one new message. Automated memo from Central. Warning. Cell Tower 34 requires immediate assistance. 75% of ESP3 smart plants down. Diagnosis. Blister beetle infection in Sector 3 lower reparistem. Time frame. Immediate treatment. Time frame. Immediate treatment. Time frame. Immediate treatment.
All right, I get it, okay? I used to love this job before towers were trees.
Precisa saber da piscina, da margarina, da Carolina, da gasolina. Você precisa saber de mim, baby, baby. Eu sei assim, baby, baby. Na lanchonete, andar com a gente aquela canção do Roberto. Baby, baby, há quanto tempo, baby, baby, há quanto você precisa aprender inglês, precisa aprender o que eu sei e o que eu não sei mais, e o que eu não sei mais. Você, comigo vai tudo azul, contigo vai tudo em paz. Vivemos na melhor cidade da América do Sul, da América do Sul.
So Amy is an architect from China, always seen with a mobile game in her hand, and in the tradition of the magical realists or Miyazaki, she's interested in telling different kinds of stories. So across the year in the studio, she's developed her own visual language. And in this film, she's painstakingly drawn the world of a computer that's grown to the size of an entire city. And people inhabit it, and they put their faith in this new God. And they put their wish on a USB prayer, and they imagine, as they plug it in, the way that the computer is able to process and calculate its future, and their future, and the future of the city. And the story is told through the eyes of three women, a hacker, a user, and a programmer that each inhabit different layers of the computer. And the project imagines an extension of the computer from the supercomputers that now process stories of climate change and tornadoes sweeping across the planet. And now they become deployed to program and imagine the futures of ourselves, where we put our faith in this new God, where technology has replaced the spiritual. So for Amy, this is a long-term project, and as she hand paints every frame, what we're going to see is a trailer of the entire film and then a black and white animatic of the entire 3-part film, where we see the 3 different characters in their sketch form. And across the next few months, I think Amy is going to continue the project and continue drawing and sketching and continue this mode of working and continue this language that she's developed.
We used to dream of the existence of gods. Gods that could know everything and create anything. Now these dreams have been built.
An architect from India, Khevna, has been concerned with the extraordinary powers of gentrification taking place in her home city of Mumbai. Here, a traditional market, so critical to the cultural identity of the city, is being lost, demolished in the shadows of the high-priced apartment towers now competing for the same land. Khevna has produced a hybrid documentary formed partly from interviews and video portraits taken of the threatened multi-generational traders and a fictional conceit, a speculative tower, a refuge that all the traders retreat to, an alternative skyline seen against the backdrop of the glass apartment towers beyond. So this endless market has become a fictional framework through which we view these stories, part field recording and part CGI world. And the film and the tower act as an archive, a container of loss, a community rescued from the point of disappearance. In Khevna's tower, it's wedding day.
कई सालों से मैं इस दिन का इंतज़ार कर रही थी। आज भी याद है मेरी दीदी का वो दिन, पूरा बाजार जैसे खुशी से तैयारियों में लग गया था। ये नए ऊंचे मकान आने से पहले मेरे पिताजी की दुकान भी यहाँ बाजार में ही थी। ये डेवलपर्स के कारण हम सबको मजबूरन वहाँ से निकलना पड़ा। खरीदारी करने की जगह से कहीं ज़्यादा था। ये लोगों के जीवन और उनकी अनोखी कहानियों का खजाना था, जो मान लो इस काल्पनिक टावर में इकट्ठा हुई है।
लता, जल्दी, बहुत सारी तैयारियां बाकी हैं। आज का दिन बहुत खास है, सब कुछ अच्छे से होना चाहिए। हमें और फूलों की जरूरत होगी। तुम जरा ऊपर की फूल मार्केट से और फूल ले आओ।
मेरा नाम है राजेंद्र खराटे। ये फूल के कम से कम मेरे पिताजी के ज़माने से मिला, और मेरा है नाम बचपन से यही धंधा है फूलों का। शादी का माला, बाशिंगे, हर एक समाज का जो शादी का फूलों का काम करता है वो सब।
बच्चों, चलो अब जल्दी से ऊपर आ जाओ। बहुत हुआ खेलना, शाम की पार्टी के लिए तैयार भी होना है। चलो, और आते वक्त राजू अंकल की दुकान से इस्त्री के कपड़े भी लेते हुए आना।
मेरा नाम राजू है। रोज मैं लगभग 200 कपड़ों की इस्त्री करता हूँ। मैं हर किसी के रोजाने का हिस्सा हूँ। जब लोग आते हैं मेरी दुकान पे अपने कपड़े लेकर, तो हमें बातें भी करने का मौका मिलता है। मैं ये शर्ट एक ग्राहक के लिए इस्त्री कर रहा हूँ, आज शाम के उत्सव के लिए। बहुत सालों बाद फिर से पूरा बाजार जी उठेगा।
मैं संजय हूँ। एक टाइम था जब हमने लगभग सब कुछ खो दिया था। नए बिल्डिंग टावर सब तरफ ऊपर आ रहे थे और हम इसके सबसे पहले शिकार थे। लेकिन आज हमारे हालात बेहतर हो रहे हैं शायद। मैंने आज शाम की दावत के लिए बहुत सारी सब्जियां बेची।
माझं नाव प्रकाश आहे. आम्ही ताशे बनवतो लग्नासाठी. कारण ताशाचं काम करतो. 20 वर्ष झाले आम्हाला इथे.
मेरा नाम किशोर जैन है. मेरा दुकान 10 से 15 साल पुराना है और मेरे यहाँ पे 4 आदमी काम करते हैं और पूजा आर्टिकल्स का काम है, ब्रास का.
मैंने बचपन से ये काम ही सीखा. इस काम की वजह से अब तो सुनाई भी कम देता है. अब तो दूसरा कोई काम मिलना भी मुश्किल है मेरे लिए. मेरे 3 बच्चे हैं. बहुत कमाई तो नहीं होती, लेकिन जितना भी मिलता है काफी होता है.
हमारा दुकान तो सुबह 10 बजे ओपन होता है और रात को 8 बजे बंद हो गया. बाकी स्टील का ऐसा होटल का माल सेल कर देते हैं.
અમારી દુકાન લગભગ 20 વર્ષથી ચાલે છે અને સાંજની ચા તો બધા અમારા ત્યાં જ કરતા હોય. અમારી કેટલીય લોકોને એક બેઠક મળે, થોડી ઇધર ઉધરની વાતો થાય અને કામ ને ભાગદોડમાં છુટકારો મળે.
हमारी ये दुकान 3 पीढ़ियों से चल रही है. मैं इस कला को सीखते सीखते बड़ा हुआ हूँ. मेरी दुकान में 10 लोग काम करते हैं. अगर हमारी दुकान बंद हो जाती है तो ये लोग कहाँ जाएंगे? ये काम ही रोजी का जरिया है.
मेरा नाम भवानी है, भवानी पुरोहित. 7 साल हो गया दुकान में. हमारे यहाँ पे शादी के लिए जैसे दुल्हन सेट वगैरह है और गले का कोई भी ज्वेलरी है अपने यहाँ.
मुझे बचपन से ही खाना पकाना बहुत पसंद है. मैं रोज सुबह लंच के डिब्बे बाजार में काम करने वाले लोगों के लिए भेजती हूँ. आज मैं बाजार में बहुत बड़ी दावत के लिए खाने की तैयारी कर रही हूँ.
ये दुकान मेरे परिवार में मेरे पिताजी के ज़माने से है. हम लेडीज़ की साड़ी और खास अवसरों के लिए जैसे ब्राइडल लहंगा भी स्टिच करते हैं. अभी अभी जो भाई साड़ी लेकर गए उस पे वर्क करते समय मुझे मेरी बहन की याद आ गई.
यहाँ सबसे ऊपर वाली मंजिलों पर अब हर कोई लगभग आ गया है. बादलों के बीच में मंदिर की घंटियों का संगीत सुनाई दे रहा है. मैं भी लगभग तैयार हूँ और सब लोगों की आवाज़ें सुन रही हूँ. कहानियों के इस टावर में सब मेरी शादी के लिए आज एक साथ फिर से आए हैं. और हम सब एक साथ एक परिवार की तरह रहा करते थे. नए मकानों के साए में अब तो सिर्फ यही सब बचा है। यहाँ अब सिर्फ कहानियाँ रहती हैं। ऐसे उत्सव ही एक समय पर बाजार को जिंदा रखा करते थे। मुझे आशा है कि ऐसे मौके और भी आते रहेंगे।
She had lots of help, I guess. So our next film is by Devin, a child of LA, Insta-famous, part of the architectural Twitterati, a Facebooking bandit, and he's interested in who we have become in this mediated, saturated age. You are your avatar, your profile pic, your follow account, your Match.com score, your swipe rightness, hashtag identity politics. And we manufacture who we are through our online content. We are our digital shadows. And in this context, AR and VR allow us to wear these media constructions like a pixel mask pinned to the body through a costume of calibration markers. And like peacocks, preening and posturing, glitching and glistening in our AR fashion, the only respite from this world of pop-ups and poses may actually be to disappear into the fog of white noise, sacrificing the physical self for an all-over distortion of irreversible digital camouflage.
Every day I see you, yet I can't recognize you. The same, but always different. Everything, yet nothing. Who are you?
Jiansen is an architect trained in China, a context of exploding density and extreme population growth. And in this context, the emergence of advanced VR technology has created the possibility of a hybrid reality where physical space can now be supplemented with the release of digital landscapes. So freed from the pressures of the physical, a superdense city has now been built that contains the entire population of the world, where the complexities of the entire urbanized planet have now been built and contain the entire population. And continents have been collapsed together, and the difference in nationalities has become the difference in city blocks. And amidst the density, the edge of the city has been forgotten, and their urban world appears without end. And lost amidst the towers, a resident dreams of a landscape outside of the simulation. And among the residents is George, a man who dreams of a lost nature and remembers a world that was once real. A VR refugee trapped in the congestion of the physical world, and he goes in search of a territory that might exist beyond the walls.
It was just one city now. We all lived here amongst the towers. In the goggles, we could live in whatever world we wanted. Virtual space was endless, and we soon left the real city behind. Just an endless mass of cubicles stretching across the earth. We forgot its edges. Perhaps it has no edges. Hey, hon. Do you remember the last time we were outside? Let's get out of here.
No. I'm in the shows.
Come on.
Don't interrupt.
Hey, going without your glasses, huh?
Just traveling. You ever been outside the city?
Oh, yeah, many times. Many times. Prefer it here, though. I mean, you have everything, you know. Anything. Good luck to you.
Here, asshole! Shit!
Wake up, man. This is the final station. You need to get off the train.
Is this the edge of the city?
I don't know. The tunnel keeps going. But this is the end of the line. You need to get your ass out of my train.
Honey, can you grab me a glass of water, please? I'm super tired and thirsty.
Big twist here, left hand to the earth, right hand to the sky. Inhale in, exhale, come back to your lunge, and we flow, moving with the breath.
Yeah. So on the left is Tim, Jiansen, Amy, Pierce, Khevna, and Devin. These guys have been hard at it all year, and everything on the screen was produced in that space of time, and it's an extraordinary learning curve. Let's give them a big round of applause. Yeah, great, thanks. Just a quick round of introductions before we get into a little conversation. You've met the students, obviously, Devin and Pierce here. This is Ruthie, who runs the Sundance New Frontiers Labs. This is Alex McDowell, production designer from such films as Minority Report, Fight Club, but also runs the World Building Lab at USC. And next to him, Peter, who runs Imaginary Forces, an extraordinary visual company doing so many of the titles and motion graphics you would see in all your favorite films. And Alex, who works with Platinum Dunes, Michael Bay's production studio, and Jesse, from creative director from Digital Domain. And this is Matt, the token architect on the panel. Matt's a journalist and writer for Architect's newspaper, taking one for the team. Thanks, Matt.
I'm a token architect.
Oh, you're an architect too, of course. I forgot Laura, but Laura's from Disney Imagineering, so you're kind of wrapped in a different guise. But Laura's an architect now, ensconced in Disney Imagineering. Geoff Manaugh, writer. Creator of the Extraordinary Building blog, author of Extraordinary Narratives and Speculative Tales. Holly Willis, who works in USC Cinema School and is a writer for such magazines as Mediopolis and Filmmaker. And we have, finishing out the student group, Amy, Jiansen, Khevna, and Tim. Ooh, okay, this is the round table from God. So what we wanted to do was, rather than kind of work through painfully the traditional architectural crit process that I'm sure a lot of people in this room have had the unfortunate pleasure of having to sit through, we wanted to just screen the work and then have a conversation around the work, rather than pulling apart each student and demoralizing them and making them walk out the door feeling that they've just been beaten up. We thought rather celebrate the work, elevate it, and talk about the sorts of themes, ideas, and concepts that the work generates, rather than things that they could have done better had they had another year to work on it. So with that in mind, what we wanted to do was actually just open it up to start with, to see if anyone had any initial thoughts. And you don't need to limit the comments to just the films that you saw, but perhaps we can talk about where this work might be placed, where it sits within the industry, the value of this mode of working, the value of thinking about speculative worlds in this way, or the value of critical storytelling, or even the value of having a program like this in a building like this, in a school like this. It's a pretty open introduction, but perhaps someone's brave enough to take the mic, or do you want me to pick on someone? All right, there we go.
Well, no, I just want to congratulate all of you. I mean, really good and really ambitious. And I love that you guys just went for it. You were using lots of tools that we're all familiar with. And maybe sometimes your reach exceeded your grasp, but that's as it should be. That's what we all do. But it was and you know, I've been on juries here and like seen the savagery. And the thing that was so nice about sitting through your films is they were all entertaining. That's, to me, that's like the first thing, right? Are you engaged? Are you entertained? I wasn't bored. I was into it. So hats off. Well done.
Well, should I go ahead? Well, I came to meet Liam, I don't know, a couple of months ago. And because at Imagineering, I started as a traditional architect, as we say, on the outside. Once you get into Imagineering, you're kind of in there. So there's this whole external world. And we operate very differently than the traditional architecture world. So we're very intrigued with the transformation of architecture programs around the country and the world that are beginning to reflect sort of the current movement in our whole society to become a more sort of immersive, narrative, experiential thing. I mean, everything is becoming experiential, and that's sort of one of the things that attracted me to Imagineering, was that there's this intersection of where placemaking becomes this really powerful way to tell a narrative, which I think is what all of you have done very powerfully tonight. So I congratulate you too, and I'm very intrigued by programs like yours, Liam, that are continuing to sort of intersect story and the power of architecture to be at the center of that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, what we're trying to do with the program, and I guess I said a little bit in my introduction, we're not trying to be a film school that just happens to exist in an architecture building, but really we're trying to make works. Often they're filmed, but they're not exclusively so. There are other projects in the studio that you haven't seen tonight, which might be a theme park or other. Or there's Devin's also working on a VR installation. But these are films, if they are making a film, that could only have been made in an architecture school, or could only have been made in a place like this, because the students come from a particular background, or at least they're working in a context where the role of a place and the world of the film is central to its story, and also central to its critical edge, I suppose. Because we believe so often that, for a large extent, architects' skills are almost wasted on the production of singular buildings as objects, and what we try and do is animate scenarios and tell stories about the forces that are shaping the spaces, communities, and cities that we all occupy and exist in. And hopefully the students' works do so in some form, but equally we want that work to leave the institution, to find its feet out in the world, in the industry, where they no longer operate as architects in an architecture discipline, but perhaps they're occupying and sitting within some of the disciplines that you guys are all a part of. And that's where I think the work truly becomes interesting, is where it finds a new audience for the sorts of things that architects spend a lot of time talking about in rooms like this one. And that's really the critical agenda for what we're trying to do with the program. I mean, maybe people want to talk about that, if people have a sense if there's a place in the world for these types of things outside of this place. Are they too niche? I wonder if you guys had any thoughts on where the students might go afterwards, the sort of things they might want to do. When we're in job offers, that would be great. Does anyone want to pick that up?
Do you want us to offer them jobs right here?
No, not that part. But perhaps thinking about the context in which these films might take place. Yeah.
I mean, I'm very curious. My interest is in how narrative drives worlds. You've obviously got a clear, that the narrative is central. I saw a lot of thematic similarity in the work, so I was wondering, in the kind of arc, how you provoked these, what's the framework that started this? how much did the students work together? Was there a kind of collective of all of the skills of the students that helped sort of generate the framing of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we live out of each other's pockets for most of the year, and inevitably references are shared. And we do begin with the discussion of a particular context. In this case, it was India. Thinking about just what that would mean if we exaggerated that context in all different ways. And a lot of the students kind of took that on board quite directly because they traveled out and used India as a location shoot or a stage set for their film. Others took some of the themes within the studio and applied them kind of tangentially. But in general, we had a conversation about productive dystopias, I suppose, as a beginning point. Like, how do we co-opt these forms which are so pervasive in contemporary culture, you know, the dark future, but how do we deploy it in a slightly different way? But I mean, maybe some of the students want to answer these questions, not just me. I don't want to
well, maybe the part two of that is, there is obviously a kind of overriding dystopia in the work. That's good to hear that was in the frame. What's the intent of the students? What do you think is the intention of the narrative in portraying those dystopias in relation to architecture specifically? And when you conjure these extremely dense urban environments and the sort of Kowloon wall cityness of it, I'm curious whether that is a kind of throwing up your hands in despair at our futures implicit, or is it actually a driver towards doing something about it and changing that?
And we were also talking about, along that line, you know, all the theme of dystopia, that, you know, your generation are the ones like driving all of the technology, right? And yet there's something deep inside you that's fearing something, I guess. You know, I see this like science fiction where it is science fiction. You're imagining the future. There's fears about the future, and you're finding a way to deal with it or forecast it. But, you know, I found that sort of at odds. You know, you're the native technologist, and yet there's this sort of is there a fundamental fear about the implications of technology on our life and our culture?
Are you guys fearful? Tim, are you fearful of a nature out of control, of a GM nature? You have to lean into the mic there, Chief. There you go.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of my film was made to offset the fears of a GMO future, which is the technology that I was more interested in, more invested in.
The seed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the fear. I mean, growing up, a generation that's always seeing technology evolve at such a rapid rate, we keep imagining what's going to happen in the future with these technologies, and the fear is a natural part of that, I think. But at the same time, at least in my film, I tried to see that it's not really necessary at times, or this fear can often prevent us from moving forward in certain fields, like biotech, for example.
Yeah, I think a lot of the films fit the archetypal cautionary tale as a storytelling frame. And just speaking personally, after going through it once as a project, I can sort of imagine that the stories that I'm interested in telling in next things that I do would have would be more generally positive in the kinds of futures that they project. Because I think the cautionary tale at the moment is a worn-out archetype, and I think it would go through cycles in which people would loop back to more positive projections of utopias, and then it's a kind of cycle. So that's for me personally what this project was about, is doing that once and realizing that maybe if I did it over again, it would be something that was more wrestling with more difficult possible futures that are difficult to see and are more positive, I guess. Yeah,
I mean, I think we're also, Pierce's film particularly grew out of a context or a set of observations from the special economic zones and the IT sectors we saw on our trips through India, where we saw certain trends emerging. And really, our engagement with technology in this way is that, the world is full of these positivist narratives of technological solutionism, right? Like, and Tim was kind of touching on that nerve in his faux Samsung Botanica advertisements. We're rushing over us like water is this dominant discourse of the latest product. Get it, it's going to be great, it's going to change your life, it's going to be wonderful, everything's going to be easier and better. And I guess we saw some of these films as a counter-narrative to that, to talk about the idea that a full-on, totally unquestioning embracing of technology is just as dangerous as a dystopian or cautionary tale. So we are hopefully putting these into the world as a means to even the balance somehow, so that we may all become more critical consumers of these technologies that we're all totally enamored with and fill our lives with in some way.
I thought it was interesting. I thought it was interesting that so many of the films, I think the only one that was not specifically about technology was Devna's, which I thought was really poetic. I thought that the end, when there was a shower of flower petals down this fabulous, taken to its kind of the CG marigolds that you were getting, done to its nth, would have been like a gorgeous, heartbreaking, poetic moment. But yours was the only film that wasn't specifically about technology, which I thought was interesting. There was obviously a dystopic aspect to it, but also a kind of optimistic and very humanist aspect to it. But so was technology called out as a subject matter, or?
It was part of the framing, I suppose, but the way that we do it is that, we just create an umbrella for the students to work with under, and they're free to, find their own paths. And unlike a lot of the studios that you'll see in this place or in an architecture school that are very much the masterclass and top-down driven, and a lot of the projects are kind of interchangeable. In the program, Alexi and I are trying to create a scaffold for students to tell stories that are personal and unique to them in a way. And I think Khevna's story is a very personal story from her own city and her own observations. But in a way, and I was trying to do that in my introductions, was trying to set up the way that all the students were taking their own attitudes towards things, and perhaps it's our own particular proclivities, but it's also, I think, that these are students of a certain age that are asking certain questions, that have certain lives they live out in the devices in our pockets, and are beginning to start to question what that means. And I think some of these questions that the students are dealing with are quite urgent, in a way.
One thing I think might be interesting to look at in terms of how to move forward or where the students could go next. This is probably the last thing you want to hear since you're in architecture school, but it would actually be interesting to see if the films could have more architecture in them. And I think that some of them missed an opportunity to really explore what the architecture of these features might look like. And I think that by putting it into the rubric of dystopia or of the fearful future of technology, I think that kind of the default structure associated with that is the endless city or the megastructure, but it's usually something that doesn't require a lot of design. It just requires a lot of repetition. You take a floor plate and you repeat it 1,000 times and you've got the city of the future. Or you add, you take a cubicle and you just multiply it by 10,000 and you've got, the Samsung city of tomorrow. But what is the role of the architect in envisioning these types of scenarios? And is there a way actually to give it an architectural form and to think about it in terms of architecture? Even the film that had the half-naked technical engineer, was there a way to explore what architecture would look like when one is enveloped in that type of semi-nudist Facebook checking? But what are the architectural implications? And I think that, I mean, one of the things that you could do too is that SCI-Arc is such a great place for fabrication. Los Angeles is such a great place for found locations and for cheap materials, that if you could actually design and build sets or design and build particular places where you can film that don't require CG, it could be really interesting to actually take architectural skills specifically and try to figure out ways to plug that skill set into these narratives, as opposed to only making films that are about technology and dystopia.
Does anyone want to do that? You want to comment on your semi-nudist Facebook colony, Devin? No, you're good.
Sounds expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and something I was trying to call out in my introduction is the way that a lot of the tools the students have been exploring this year, tools that Alexi spends a lot of time coaching them through, just a few years ago were the domain of silicon graphics engines and extraordinarily big Hollywood budgets, and now for the most part they sit on our laptop, or at least can be pirated in some form, and run to develop these things. And I guess this year we're interested in how we could start to play with those tools, but actually run a kind of more indie-style narrative through them. So that, I mean, the particular skill set within the teaching school at the moment is for these kind of CGI rendered films and images, and that's where we went to. But it was also part of the idea of exploring what these tools might mean in the hands of a group of students like this, not in the hands of the guy that does Deadpool. And I think that's an interesting experiment in some form. But I mean, we're also in a building that has, an extraordinary robot house that you can stick a camera on and start to develop stop motion animations, where the models that we build as architects are actually props for films. And I think that interest in bringing to bear the skills of the architect on the filmmaking process is also super interesting. And certainly an opportunity for future years, yeah.
I saw some SCI-Arc in your plants, in your Samsung.
Some of it's got to rub off.
Smell-o-vision. Yeah, there was some architecture in there, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I also one thing that'd be interesting to get you guys read on is. I mean, we deliberately kind of curated the panel in such a way to have people from a range of different professions that are all somehow connected to the industry of this city. And perhaps some of you want to speak on just how, or if you think some of these types of stories or worlds actually play out in these contexts, or do they? A big part of what we're trying to do in the studio, as I said, is try and get these stories out of this building, out of the institution and into the world, and seen by people, engage them in some of the narratives which are so familiar in a context like this one, where we can just throw away these kind of these terms like dystopia and critical technologies. I mean, do you think there is a space in the industry? Is there a space for a critical story? And how might we start to tell it? And how might these students find a way of doing that within this context?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Right. So the next question.
Maybe to tie that together, we recently set out at the newspaper to survey the state of speculation today, looking at an exhibition that in New York that deals with all the past speculations that were never built. So these kind of grand visions for the city that weren't built. And we wanted to set out and find out what that might look like today. Like what might be when in 2050, when they look back at what wasn't built, what is being speculated today that isn't going to be built. And it was really actually pretty hard to find within architecture kind of interesting speculations. And so we ended up kind of finding those in other disciplines, like within a lot of it was like hyper-capitalist speculations, like Hyperloop and driverless cars, and a lot of stuff actually we couldn't even talk about because it was being done by industries that have NDAs and stuff. So I guess it's a little refreshing to see this in the architecture world being discussed and being dealt with, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it's being dealt with in a medium outside of architecture. But at the same time, sort of, it's an architectural problem, and it's still being dealt with in architectural ways. So, I mean, it's just a really refreshing, I think, to see this kind of stuff being projected out, our knowledge or our discipline being projected through a different medium, which is, I guess, filmmaking. I think it's got a lot of potential, maybe, to reach different audiences and to help architecture think about society in ways that maybe it's lost its ability to. And if we think about things like Archigram and some of the past paper architecture, maybe now it's not paper architecture, but it's like filmic architecture or something. So, I don't know. It was really exciting, so thank you.
Well, architecture tends to be pretty elitist and actually kind of fairly repellent to the general public. And I think going through the medium of film is something that, you know, everybody really understands today. So I think that's a great way to, you know, envision things and translate ideas. I think I would love to see, as some people suggested, the part 2 of what you all did. You know, you envisioned these worlds, and they were a result of something, and I would love to see then how you go to the next step to maybe project a solution. You know, so some of those worlds had maybe a different path. But I think, and I don't mean to ramble here, but you know, the use of humor in some of this I thought was really fantastic. In fact, I think in most of them there was humor, irony, and I think that you know is also a very engaging tool in your narrative.
I wanted to say something. I was thinking as I was watching the films how these are different from the films that would be made in the production division in the School of Cinematic Arts, which is a very traditional filmmaking program. And I was struck by the sense that there wasn't the kind of propulsive narrative, and there wasn't the demand for a coherent kind of temporal and spatial structure that you would find in a kind of mini Hollywood short film. There was a much more ambient kind of narrative and an attention to the space that I thought was really strong and interesting. And I think that aligns with shifts that we're seeing in film theory that don't align with what we're doing in our film school anyway, around affect, around the post-cinema, around post-humanism, and thinking about the ways in which we can represent that in narrative by a diminishing of the sort of main character and a rethinking of narrative and space and time. So I thought there was real potential there. And I could also imagine these as projects that are installations, that are things that you go and kind of enjoy within a space. Thinking of Hito Sterol's work that was at MoCA last year that was so fantastic. Things like that where you're kind of in the space with the medium rather than sitting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting space in between the architectural fly-through and kind of a more traditional filmic narrative, right? Where, I mean, perhaps architects are terrible at story and terrible at character, but we're amazing at worlds. So we kind of direct the projects more towards narratives that aren't reliant on a performance or a particular line delivered in a particular way. And hopefully what you get is soft narrative in a way, and a much more subtle story. But you get a kind of an immersive sense of what this world is, where you can start to invent and imagine your own stories and your own characters. But yeah, I think I know from your writing that kind of plugs into a current trend in post-cinema, which we find super interesting. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, I know just by visiting your class before that many of you had a part 2 ambition, if you will. So I'm really curious to to see those. I know these, as you said, were very ambitious projects, especially for any year, and many of them with a background not related specifically to the tools used to make the film. So bravo. And I'm very curious to see, especially given the way that you very clearly can think about space and world building, what that might look like in other forms, like virtual reality or augmented reality. I know some of you were dealing with them topically because that's what you felt like you could fit in the container of time and space in this particular exercise. But I would encourage you to continue on those pursuits as well. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about what their part 2 vision was, but I think some of those were really fascinating, and I think you are some of the right minds to keep thinking about those things.
Yeah,
in terms of virtual and physical space. It felt like this was a lot for me about like the anxiety of the organic. All of them kind of had that same and dealt with it in a really different way, whether it was through these plants, like right now we don't value plants, and then this extreme value in plants, or Amy with your film, it's this obsession with technology, and instead of making technology smaller, it became bigger, and that your process was so organic that literally you did it by hand. Anyway, I could call out each of you, but I just think it's really beautiful the way that you dealt. Everyone had a different approach, and so I'm curious about those forms going forward.
Yeah, I mean, does anyone want to speak to that? Or where it is you think the work might go?
Or maybe you don't want to anymore, and that was an idea. But
Right. I mean, maybe this is a good time to ask you, Alex, a question, because you're kind of moving, or you were moving away from more traditional world building in film to finding different audiences for those worlds that may exist in a corporate sphere or in the worlds of VR and AR. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, just the different sites that a world builder might find traction and how that might start to work. Maybe that would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, let me see if to go into it. I want to pick up a little bit on what Holly was saying about the post-cinematic, because I think that is certainly the area that I'm very interested in. Like, how do you fold these tools into new media forms or new a kind of evolution of media? And actually, just to use a metaphor from one of the students' films, I think going back to the one about the wedding, I'm sorry, I forget the name of the film.
Khevna.
Yeah. That I saw there the possibility of this architectural world that was, multidimensional, where the transitions were these beautiful entry points into an infinite number of stories. There was no limit to how many narratives you could have told through that device. And I think what would be fascinating to me is to see the architectural discipline applied to the actual structure of how one thinks about the medium. Because that's a four-dimensional, I mean, it's already a four-dimensional medium, but if one were to shift that into literally a kind of spatial exploration of narrative, and you could imagine all of these films threaded through a device like that. So part of what I think would be really exciting is to start thinking about process towards a post-cinematic that isn't so much trying to get architects into cinema profession, which I don't think is necessary. I mean, to me, cinema is the most conservative medium that I deal with.
Dry architecture.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
It's neck and neck.
But combining, the instincts towards narrative, which is beautifully kind of hitting architecture where it fails the most, which is to actually place a human in the center of the environment. And then see if one couldn't create, start thinking about the medium itself and stranding. So the part 2 to me is, how do you move beyond the notion of cinema as this very traditional, I mean, even though the visual effects and the work is amazing for the, within the framework that you've done it, it's very traditional in visual effects terms, in terms of the short history of that industry. So how do you push that further? You mentioned the robotics lab and things like that. I mean, there are such great tools that architecture has that if you apply them to the human in the center of the narrative and start creating essentially a new industry. That would be exciting.
Yeah, and what are the talk about the anxiety of the organic, what are the different interfaces that humans can be embodied in digital ways? I think that's maybe building on or repeating what you're saying in a different way, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question in this context as well, because it's really a question of sight, right? And architects always deal and have always dealt with sight and context, whether that be the direct adjacencies of what is around a particular building. In the studio, we talk about the thickness of the screen as a site that has its own kind of context, and part of that context is audience. But what you're talking about is the potential for totally emergent, new and unexpected sites, whether that's the lens of Oculus Rift or the luminous space of AR projected on top of the city, or any number of kind of experimental territories that I'm sure in Ruthie in your labs you start to speak with artists about. And I think that's a really interesting territory that the course is going to start to push in subsequent years. It's just to figure out what those new spaces might mean, especially in the context of architecture, where it's very much a discipline on fire in traditional terms, where the traditional roles of the architect are being increasingly marginalized. Where do we find those new sites of traction?
And in that way, this is more of a documentation of that process rather than the final product. It's a documentation of the building of those future interfaces versus the conservatism of a final flat frame. Yeah.
I'm curious, how many of you want to be filmmakers?
Liars. They all want to be filmmakers.
No, but I mean, to Alex's point, I mean, it's sort of a trick question, because the whole definition of filmmaker is so elastic now. But did you guys enjoy because these were traditional films, right? Even though it was kind of, how did you refer to it? Soft narrative. Fair enough, but you were making something that took place over 6 minutes or 10 minutes and had a beginning and a middle and an end.
Well, what I think was kind of really interesting is maybe not filmmakers, but like architecture seems to, you tell stories with I recently was introduced to this program. I think it's pretty amazing. And I think architectures in general tell stories with physical spaces, and it's really interesting to tell stories using your skills and applying it to filmmaking. Because each one of these, the architecture was a key component of the storytelling. It was like vice versa, whether or not the character was designed from the actual architecture, or the architecture was designed from the character, which I thought was really interesting, the program. So each one of you, I think, you're like storytellers, like physically, like building, like architecture, or storytellers through film. I think it was really interesting. So.
Yeah, I think, and I want to come back to this point about who wants to be a filmmaker, because they're all lying. They all want to be filmmakers.
But I really want to do is direct.
There's something really handy and satisfying that I have to say. Look at the penetration of headsets, for example. Like, if we're thinking about that frame, there's something really satisfying about being able to have this very portable, packageable. It's different than architecture even, right? Like, even a model is not a portable, packageable, shareable kind of way of expressing the documentation of that thought.
Yeah.
So, of course, that makes sense that satisfaction is pleasant,
Yeah. I think it's also, again, one of the kind of the core ideas behind the starting of this program was that architects have always found a way into your industries. Right, I'm sure you're all working with them or have collaborated in some form or another with people that have this kind of background, but it's always been through a bit of a hustle, right? It's always just been through luck, circumstance, or a sheer working of the system. What are the ways that we can start to formalize those processes of transition, so that students that practitioners that want to actually operate as architects but don't necessarily want to be making buildings, what can they do and where can they go? And I think we're just at the beginning of that conversation. But whether they have the energy to speak up for it now or not, each one of these students is here for a reason like that. That for whatever reason, they're either disillusioned, upset, frustrated, or bored with the traditional realities of practice, and are interested in talking about the ideas that we talk about, but doing it through other mediums and through other voices and through other contexts and sites. So maybe they don't all want to be filmmakers, but they certainly don't want to be architects in the way that we might.
Is that really true? Is that true?
That makes me sad. Do any of you want to be an architect?
Slept on a fucking
But
panel.
I mean, there's something funny about, like, you know, which artists want to be engineers, which engineers want to be artists. I think there's something really special about having that partnership between different kinds of thoughts, where an engineer is an artist and an artist is an engineer. And, you know, I mean, I think that's what you're trying to elicit from your question. But I think that kind of thinking has a very important place. And I mean, you've assembled this kind of amazing dream team of different kinds of people approaching this from different ways. But I think it's that same concept, like all different fields need that kind of architectural thinking.
Yeah, I think what's great about what you're doing, Liam, is that you're pushing towards this kind of notion of post-disciplinary. Yeah. And I think that is, if anyone wants a job in the future, it's becoming post-disciplinary or intradisciplinary. You know, to be adept, to be able to move fluidly from programming and coding to physical construction. I think that's crucial. The other second part two of the answer to your question, I think, in terms of where this is going and having influence, is that the questions we're being asked by the corporations is to narrate complex systems that don't yet exist. And I think that architects, and to kind of encourage the critical thinking of architecture towards complex systems, and starting to apply that sort of structural knowledge, oops, sorry, am I doing it? That structural knowledge to narrative, to be able to convey convincing narratives that both embody complex systems in the way that I'm sort of imagining some medium that doesn't yet exist, that's multi-layered, multi-stranded, but actually, in terms of content, pulls together the capabilities of architects and designers and artists and scientists, etc., that kind of crossing those borders to be able to actually create models for stories of, worlds of, that describe complex systems that don't exist yet, is the crucial sort of meaning of our times, I think.
What I think is really interesting to kind of your approach is it's almost like reverse engineering. I think the landscape of storytelling is drastically changing in like a more commercial type means. The way we consume content is changing. And so you, it seems like, approach it towards, you're starting with the world. And I think that's interesting because you're not limiting yourself to one certain narrative, where you can create many different narratives from this universe that, you know, you've kind of conceived. And just with the nature, again, of like the ever-changing landscape, I think that's really essential. And again, what was really fascinating about all of your work is, even though there are definitely similar currents to the themes dealing with technology, whether it's effective or kind of influencing us in a way that, you know, it's controlling us, whether we're in control, dystopic, utopia, you know, there are similarities there. But yeah, I think that, you know, it is really interesting kind of how you can kind of create this landscape and then take a story and build it afterwards. So it was I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Just to go back to stuff that you were saying about the role of the filmmaker or the architect, I mean, I think that I guess I'd be wary of disincentivizing the students to step away from architecture too much, and I think that you can actually find the future, so to speak, through architectural design itself. And I think that just a couple really random but fast anecdotes. A couple years ago, actually, in an event that Liam and I co-hosted in London, there was a really interesting talk from an individual whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, who pointed out that in order to design a future Paris for a project that he was working on, he just said
Victor Antonov.
Okay, sure, it was Victor Antonov, that his technique basically was to take all of the existing sort of, I mean, this is a very sort of postmodern thing, but the expected proportions and ornaments and detail that you would find that makes Parisian architecture Parisian, and then just exaggerating it in such a way that it was obvious that it was Paris, but it was also obvious that it was an historical era that hasn't happened yet, and so that you've got this kind of the present exaggerated through science fiction in the form of architecture becomes this really beautiful futuristic environment that is also, I mean, frankly, it was gorgeous and it's architecturally exciting, not just exciting from the point of view of a science fiction novelist. But then even a couple years ago, Liam and I also had an interesting lunchtime experience with an individual with Sid Mead, who had worked on Blade Runner, et cetera, and the question that came up was, if Blade Runner was made today and not in the 1980s, and Liam, you mentioned this earlier, Blade Runner was made at a very particular era in the United States where Japan was economically ascendant. It was very, very influential across the Pacific and specifically in the city of LA. But if you were to make Blade Runner today, where there's a much stronger South and Central American and Latino influence on Los Angeles, and if you were to redesign Blade Runner as a kind of Latino futurism, what would it look like? And I think that question is not only interesting demographically and politically, but it's fascinating from an architectural point of view. As a designer, I want to see that world. I want to know what happens in Latino science fiction in Los Angeles in the future. And then also, just to go back to actually something just from tonight, Liam, when you were talking about the Indian influence, I think that's a really, maybe that's a great moment to showcase the futurist possibilities of architecture, where if India is the next superpower, and if India has an influence that architects are engaging with here, what does that look like architecturally? And I think that one of the reasons why all of this is interesting is that it validates what you guys do, what the students in this room and the professionals in this room, for that matter, do architecturally. That you have the skills to do this, to give shape to a new world that people are moving into every second of every day. But you can help give shape to that, and you can have fun designing it as architects. And then also, you have the ability then to find an audience for your work. Because what I have found, at least through writing about architecture, is that everybody is interested in architecture. Your uncle who is adding a bathroom to the back of his shack in Alabama is interested in architecture. Somebody who watches sitcoms is interested in the types of settings that they see in that television show. And to find an audience for architectural visions, whether it's through designing these kind of ethno-futuristic cities of the future, or if it's through imagining economic scenarios that would produce a kind of superpower India, that is the way that you're going to find clients and job offers, for that matter, because people will be interested in architecture as a vision of the future.
Yeah, and I would echo too, I mean, as an architect sitting here, I would hope we're in the middle of an architecture school, that we're not precluding folks from going on to be architects. I think the premise I read of your course, this particular Master of Architecture, is that architects are really great thinkers and problem solvers, and I think that's something that I love about working at Imagineering, is that it's not just about a building on a site, but that architects are working, shoulder to shoulder with story writers and scenic illusion experts, and are just as qualified to be thinking up like extraordinary ways to solve things or to tell stories. And so what I love about this program is that you're making the typical architecture student much broader. That you're empowering them that it's okay to think beyond just the four walls of a building. I mean, there's firms out there now, I think particularly like Bjarke Ingels with Big Architects, that he approaches projects with like this delight and curiosity and this sort of ability to think not like a traditional architect. He's thinking about creating a place. And anyway, I think you're developing these really broad ways of looking at things, and I think architects can be highly successful in any industry looking at how you solve things.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree, except with the bit about Bjarke Ingels, maybe. But I think, yeah, don't misunderstand. I think that, I think the power of the training of an architect is extraordinary, right? And that we're here in this building, and despite any number of things I've personally done, I still write on my customs form architect as my profession. And I guess what we're trying to do with the program is not in any way diminish or provide an escape route from people away from architecture, but to create a scaffold where people can operate as architects inside a whole range of different discourses. And that kind of dissolution of the profession, I don't think is a weakening, but it's a strengthening.
I agree with that.
Because it cites people in places just like yours, in Imagineering, or the architect working in imaginary forces, or when we have starting a kind of internship with Framestore, and we have one of our students in there at the moment. Like the architect as director, the architect as world builder, the architect as technologist or politician. All of these are really interesting sites, but they're still architects, and they're still operating with the extraordinary training that we might get in a place like this. But they're not necessarily just making buildings. I think that's really the point of difference. And again, it's this question of site. They're not necessarily creating things in the world on particular sites in the way that we traditionally understand them, but they're working within a corporation as a site, or the thickness of the iPhone as a site, right? I think that's where it becomes interesting and empowering for the profession in a new way. Do any of the students have any questions for our guests? Any things they wanted to raise? Any thoughts? Pierce, you were going to come back. You were about to say something.
I mean, I was just going to say that I think it's still architecture because this is still modeling. It's sort of touching on what Alex said about models. That's why this is still architecture. Architects make physical models. We make movies that work in a similar fashion, which is that they allow us to think possibilities and envision possibilities. So that's why I think it's still definitely squarely within the realm of architecture. And I think architects generally, broadly defined, are people that model possibilities in advance. If that.
Well said.
Yeah, and I also, and to come back to your point about complexity, Alex, and I think that's also one of the great opportunities for us as spatial thinkers, but also as storytellers. And I'm referring to a phrase by Alex Stefan, system storytelling, like that the story becomes a way of cutting through this extraordinary complexity, packaging it and disseminating it to audiences in a form that they can actually start to develop an emotional relationship to. And the last event I organized, not here, but in my past life in New York, was called Data Drama, which was trying to talk about the way that we can use story as opposed to data visualization, just to visualize complexity, but to present information in a way that audiences can develop emotional relationships to, right? Like, we're so used to being bombarded with facts and figures. We know everything's fucked. We still drive our SUV. We still turn the air conditioning on instead of taking a jumper off. But how do you find a way to make people complicit in these systems, to force them to see their own place within them? And I think part of that is the story, because it's extraordinary literacy that we all have with film, or with a book, or with a tale, or with a character. And I guess as architects, we've always missed that opportunity to connect to people through those mediums with the ideas that we normally talk about. And I think that's really the work to be done, I think, for the studio and for all this type of work in many ways. Yeah.
I'm reminded a little bit of an idea about the future, where I forget who said this, but they said that the future is already here, but it's just not evenly distributed.
Bruce Sterling?
William Gibson.
William Gibson said that, and I guess I could see that sort of in your films. It's sort of this marbling of the future and the present together, and to that ends, I guess there's also this kind of combination too of a positivist future and a negative future, and it would be interesting to me to see what, like, a lot of this was pretty dystopian, which also is like really interesting, but it would be kind of funny to see what, like, what the hyper capitalist future would be, where everything's perfect
future.
And maybe or like the Elon Musk future. Like what if everything's just perfect and great? Like what if there's like a positive and logical conclusion of all of this?
Well, in the audience is also the next crop of students that start on Wednesday. The gauntlet is laid down, the challenge is there. You can come back next year and tell us how naive we are about all these positive futures. And we'll see how that goes. But that's great. We should wrap up. Are there any closing thoughts from the panel or the students that you wanted to say something? Fantastic. Thank you. Keep going. Yeah. It's great. I mean, this is the end. We should call out, this is the end for this group of students. They leave us now and they go out into the world.
What
and
happens to them?
Try and continue to make work like this. I think they take you aside and ask for your business card afterwards, Peter. I think that's what generally happens. I don't know. I mean, that's what does happen to them. We're about to find out. And if you have any clues, then please, it'd be great to discuss them with the students, because it's been an extraordinary year, and a big thanks to Alexi. So much of what you see on the screen is really his extraordinary input and skills and talent and technical ability. Because we shouldn't understate this. A lot of these students, they may have had traditional architectural background, or someone like Pierce comes to us entirely from anthropology and barely had used Photoshop. It's an extraordinary learning curve they go on. What?
I still can't use it.
True.
Just nuking Max. Yeah.
It really is a long process, and it requires an extraordinary amount of dedication from the student, and it's wonderful to see. But the exciting point now is to see what they do with that set of skills, and where they go with it. So I think it's a really exciting moment. So thanks, guys, for all being a part of it, and thanks for giving up your time on a Friday night to watch the films and share the wine and listen to us ramble. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
for
thank
everything.
you. Very much.